A black woman boards a first-class flight. Her presence quiet but commanding. She takes her seat, ready for a long trip home after weeks of high-stakes meetings. But when a flight attendant approaches, the air shifts. The service is cold, dismissive even. Small things, subtle things, but they pile up. The woman holds her composure, as she always does, until 3 minutes later, the flight attendant learns exactly who she is and everything changes. What happened next left the entire cabin in stunned silence. And the ripple effect was felt far beyond that flight. Stay with me, this is a story you won't forget. Before we dive in, let me know in the comments where you're watching from. And if stories like this resonate with you, make sure to subscribe for more. Some moments seem ordinary, but they reveal far more than we expect. The sky was a clean, blinding blue, the kind that stretched out endlessly, making you feel both grounded and terribly small at the same time. Camille Jackson sat in the first-class cabin, staring at that sky through the oval window as the plane prepared for takeoff. Her reflection ghosted faintly in the glass, sharp lines of her tailored suit. Hair neatly tucked into a low bun, lips pressed together in a line that could have been confidence or exhaustion. She traveled often, too often, perhaps, but that was the price of the life she had built. The life no one had handed to her, but one she had carved out of the world with her own 2 hands. The hum of boarding announcements crackled through the cabin, and passengers shuffled in, trailing carry-ons and the weight of their own lives. Camille remained still, her hands folded on her lap, watching the city shrink beneath the wing. Across the aisle, a flight attendant, Karen, moved with a certain stiffness. She was young, blonde, the kind of woman whose polite smile never quite touched her eyes. Camille noticed these things. She had learned to notice them. "Good afternoon, ma'am. Would you like something to drink?" Karen's voice was smooth but mechanical, her eyes already flicking to the next passenger. "Water, please," Camille replied, her voice soft but certain. Karen nodded, but there was something in the way her gaze lingered. A flicker of hesitation, a calculation. Camille recognized it instantly, the quiet, almost imperceptible pause that spoke louder than words. She wasn't unfamiliar with it. The glance that lasted a second too long. The hesitation wrapped in a practiced smile. The invisible line drawn between her and the rest of the world. Karen didn't realize who she was yet. Camille could feel it. It was a peculiar thing how invisibility worked. A woman like Camille could be everywhere and nowhere at once. She could occupy the same space as everyone else and still be mistaken for something less. Something other. As Karen continued down the aisle, Camille exhaled, the tightness in her chest unwinding by degrees. It was a small thing. After all, a look, a moment. She had spent years teaching herself that such moments were not worth her attention. But even as the plane lifted, carrying her high above the clouds, that weight stayed with her. The first crack came during the meal service. Karen returned, this time with a tray of drinks and the same distant professionalism. "Champagne?" she asked the man in the aisle seat beside Camille. He declined, laughing easily, and Karen turned toward Camille. "Champagne for you?" There it was again, that flicker. That faint, imperceptible tightening at the corners of Karen's mouth. "No, thank you. Just water." Karen lingered for half a breath longer than necessary. She adjusted her posture, smoothing her uniform as if something about Camille's presence required correction. "Let me know if you change your mind." Camille nodded politely, but inside, something shifted. There was a strange, quiet violence to moments like these. A subtle erosion, not the sharp, overt sting of words or slurs, but the slow grinding down of being seen as less deserving. Less belonging, less. And the most dangerous part was how easy it was to ignore. How quickly it could be swept aside as trivial, imagined, or the fault of oversensitivity. But Camille knew better. The cracks widened when Karen made her rounds a second time, stopping by Camille's row with a pitcher of water. "Would you like a refill?" Camille looked up, catching the brief flash of Karen's eyes scanning her seat. Her clothes, her posture. There was something else now. Recognition. Karen's smile shifted, softening by degrees. "You're Camille Jackson, aren't you?" Camille raised an eyebrow, watching as Karen's face colored faintly. "I thought I recognized you from somewhere." Karen added quickly, the words tumbling over themselves. The apology was unspoken, but they're all the same. Camille smiled, not unkindly. "I suppose I am." Karen's hands tightened on the picture, her gaze briefly lowering. I didn't realize. I just want to say, I admire the work you've done. Thank you, Camille said, the weight of the exchange settling in the quiet between them. Karen lingered for another second, as if she wanted to say more, but ultimately she moved on. Camille watched her retreat, exhaling a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Even now, with all she had achieved, the world still found ways to remind her of what it saw first. Outside the window, the sky remained as vast and indifferent as ever. Camille Jackson had learned to live with the weight of it, but she wondered, not for the first time, how long she would have to. The cabin settled into its rhythm. Soft murmurs, the rustle of newspapers, the faint clink of ice against glass. These were the sounds that filled the space between strangers suspended 30,000 feet above the ground. Camille Jackson rested her hands on her lap, her gaze flicking once more to the window. Though the sky beyond offered little distraction, it wasn't the sky she was thinking about. Karen had not returned to her row since the last exchange, but Camille could still feel the faint residue of the moment lingering in the air. Recognition often came with a double edge, one side gleaming with admiration, the other dulled by something harder to name. Camille had lived long enough to know that being admired was not the same as being respected. From across the aisle, she could hear Karen's voice, brighter now, more animated as she spoke to an older gentleman in the front row. He laughed, a deep and easy sound that carried across the cabin. Karen lingered there, chatting longer than she needed to. Camille understood. There were places you were expected to linger, and there were places you weren't. Even here, in first class, a space Camille had paid for just like everyone else, there were boundaries drawn beneath the surface. Karen wasn't unkind. No, that wasn't the word for it. But there was a distance. A polite, practiced distance that people carried like armor when they didn't quite know how to bridge the gap. Camille wasn't sure which part of her, the woman, the black woman, or the powerful woman, created the distance. But she could feel it. All the same, the hum of the plane deepened as they drifted into cruising altitude. Camille glanced at her tablet, scrolling through unread emails, but the words blurred together. It wasn't Karen's fault, not entirely. These things, the glances, the subtle shifts in tone, were part of a language Camille had spent her entire life learning to interpret. It was a language written in hesitation, in the second glances of store clerks, in the way doors sometimes opened slower for her than for others. A language written in the way her success was so often described as impressive or unexpected, as if what she had achieved defied the natural order of things. Her father used to call it the long shadow. Baby girl, he'd say, you walk in with the sun on your back, and they don't know if they're supposed to look at you or the shadow you cast. Camille had long since learned to stop worrying about the shadow, but she could still feel the weight of it trailing behind her. A light tap on her shoulder pulled her from her thoughts. She turned to find Karen standing there once more, a glass of champagne in hand. I thought you might like this, Karen said softly, offering the glass with a small, tentative smile. Camille hesitated for half a breath. She could see the effort the way Karen's eyes flicked downward for just a moment, as if unsure of how the gesture would be received. It was an offering, but not without expectation. Camille accepted the glass with a nod, cradling it lightly between her fingers. Thank you. Karen lingered a beat too long, as if waiting for Camille to say something more, to bridge the silence hanging between them. Camille let the silence settle. By the time Karen walked away, Camille placed the champagne gently on the tray table without taking a sip. As the hours slipped by, Camille let her mind drift. It wasn't until much later, when the plane was well into its flight and most of the cabin had quieted, that she noticed Karen speaking to another flight attendant near the front. Their voices were low, but not so low that Camille couldn't catch the tail end of the conversation. I didn't realize who she was at first. Can you believe that? The other flight attendant chuckled, shaking her head. She carries herself like someone important, Karen added, her voice soft but distinct. But still, I guess I just didn't expect it. Camille's fingers tightened slightly around the stem of the glass. It was not the words that caught her off guard. It was the ease with which they were spoken. The casual way Karen felt comfortable enough to acknowledge out loud the quiet assumptions she had made. Camille wasn't angry. She had learned a long time ago that anger was a luxury she couldn't afford. Instead, she felt the familiar weight settle deeper into her chest. Expectation. Expectation that she should be graceful about it. That she should smile and let the moment pass because that was the cost of existing in certain spaces. She could already hear the words forming in her head, words she had spoken 1,000 times before. It's fine, don't worry about it. But something about this moment felt different. Maybe it was the weariness that had been creeping in over the past few months. Or maybe it was the growing realization that no matter how many rooms she walked into, no matter how many boardrooms bore her name, there would always be someone surprised to see her there. The plane began its descent, and Camille sat back, watching the skyline come into focus beneath the clouds. Karen passed by one last time, pausing briefly at Camille's row. "Thank you for flying with us, Ms. Jackson. I hope you enjoyed the flight." Camille met her gaze, searching for something recognition, maybe, or an apology unspoken. She found neither. Just the same polite, professional smile that Karen had worn when she first approached her. "Thank you," Camille said simply, her voice even, as she stepped off the plane and into the terminal. Camille let the weight of the moment slip from her shoulders. But she knew, as surely as she knew the ground beneath her feet, that it would follow her. It always did. The airport terminal was a strange liminal space, neither here nor there. A place where people moved with purpose but seemed disconnected from the world outside. Camille Jackson walked through it with the same measured grace she carried everywhere else. Her heels clicking softly against the polished floor. It was a practiced rhythm, one she had learned not out of vanity, but necessity. To move quietly through spaces that weren't made for you required precision. You had to be noticeable, but not too noticeable, present, but never disruptive. As Camille approached the baggage claim, she could feel the eyes. They were never obvious. A glance, a slight shift in posture. The way a conversation paused just a second too long when she passed. It was the same language Karen had spoken on the plane. The same hesitation she had carried in her voice. Camille had been speaking this language for as long as she could remember. There was a kind of exhaustion that came with it, an exhaustion that settled not in the body, but in the bones, in the spaces between the moments when no one was watching. By the time she reached the carousel, most of the passengers from the flight had already gathered. The older man who had laughed with Karen now stood with his wife, their heads close as they whispered to one another. A young couple scrolled through their phones, leaning against their matching luggage. Camille stood apart, her eyes fixed on the slow crawl of the conveyor belt. It was a small thing, the distance between her and the others. But small things had a way of accumulating. "Excuse me," a voice said beside her. Camille turned to find a man in his late 40s, dark suit. Expensive watch, the faint scent of cologne trailing after him. He smiled, polite but distant. "I couldn't help but notice you on the flight," he began, his tone casual in a way that felt practiced. "You're Camille Jackson, aren't you?" Camille offered a small nod. "I am. I thought so. My wife reads about you all the time, Turner Enterprises. Right?" "Yes, that's right," Camille replied, the smile she gave him measured and professional. The man nodded, clearly pleased with himself. "It's impressive, what you've built. You must be one hell of a woman to make it this far." Camille's smile didn't falter, but she felt the weight of his words settle on her shoulders. One hell of a woman. She knew what he meant by that. It was a compliment wrapped in barbed wire. A recognition of her success that carried the unspoken assumption that it was surprising that women like her didn't often find themselves in positions like this. "I do my best," Camille said, her voice even. The man chuckled. "Well, whatever you're doing, it's working. It's refreshing to see someone different at the top." There it was. Camille's gaze didn't waver, but inside she felt the familiar tightening of something fragile and unrelenting. Different. It was a word that followed her everywhere. She was different from the other CEOs. Different from the men who filled the boardrooms. Different from the passengers who sipped champagne in first class. It didn't matter how many titles she accumulated, how many articles were written about her. The world still saw her as different. The carousel whirred to life, and Camille spotted her luggage as it rounded the corner. She stepped forward, lifting the bag with ease. "It was nice meeting you," she said, her voice polite but final. The man nodded, but she could feel his eyes linger as she walked away. By the time Camille stepped outside, the late afternoon sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the airport's glass facade. A black car idled at the curb, the driver already waiting by the trunk. Ms. Jackson, he greeted, dipping his head respectfully as he took her luggage. Welcome back. Camille slid into the backseat, the door closing with a soft thud. As the car pulled away from the curb, she leaned her head against the cool leather, letting out a slow breath. For a moment, the world outside the window blurred. The streets of San Francisco, the storefronts, the pedestrians, they all faded into the background, leaving Camille alone with her thoughts. The exchange with the man at baggage claim had been brief, harmless, even, but Camille knew better than to dismiss it. It wasn't the words themselves that lingered, it was what they revealed. How quickly people categorized her. How effortlessly they slipped into the belief that her presence was an anomaly. She could hear her mother's voice echoing from years ago, spoken in the kitchen of their small Harlem apartment. Don't ever let them think you don't belong. Camille, walk into every room like it was built for you. Camille had spent years mastering that walk. But there were days like today when even the strongest posture couldn't erase the feeling that the ground beneath her was not as steady as it appeared. The car slowed as it approached the high rise where Camille's office was located. The glass doors reflected the city lights, shimmering like distant stars. As she stepped into the lobby, Camille straightened her shoulders, smoothing down her blazer. There was work to be done. But even as she ascended in the elevator, Camille couldn't shake the feeling that no matter how high she climbed, the world would always be waiting for her to prove she belonged there. And perhaps, she thought, that was the quietest battle of all. The office lights were sharp and clinical against the fading twilight. Camille Jackson stepped off the elevator, heels tapping steadily on the marble floors, the sound echoing faintly down the hall. The receptionist at the front desk, a young woman with a cautious smile, straightened as Camille approached. Good evening, Ms. Jackson. The board is already inside, she said, her tone polite but edged with something Camille had grown accustomed to, a subtle tightness. Like the woman was unsure if she should be warm or merely efficient. Camille gave a small nod, the same nod she gave to strangers who hadn't yet decided what box she fit into. Thank you, she replied, her voice even. The boardroom stretched out before her like a stage, and Camille paused at the door, listening. The low hum of conversation slipped through the crack in the wood. The voices inside light, familiar. She recognized the cadence immediately, the easy banter of men who had known each other for years. Their lives stitched together by connections older than her career. Camille took a breath. She had walked through doors like this for decades, but the weight of it never quite disappeared. Pushing the door open, Camille stepped inside, her entrance smoothing the conversation into silence. Thomas, the CFO, rose slightly from his seat, flashing her a practiced smile. Camille, we were just talking about next quarter's projections. She smiled back, the kind of smile that concealed as much as it revealed. I'm sure you were, she replied, taking her seat at the head of the table. The men around her gray suits and watchful eyes greeted her with nods of acknowledgement. They were polite, as they always were, but beneath the surface, Camille could sense it. It wasn't hostility. No, that would have been easier to confront. It was something quieter, the hesitation, the unspoken distance. As the meeting began, Camille listened, pen resting lightly against the notepad in front of her. They spoke about numbers, projections, and growth models, language she understood better than most. But she wasn't listening for the words. She was listening for the spaces between them. There was a moment halfway through Thomas's presentation when she caught it. A glance. Two men, seated near the far end of the table, exchanged a look. It was brief, but Camille caught the flicker of recognition in their eyes. She knew that look. It was the same look Karen had given her on the plane. The same look the man at the baggage claim wore when he realized who she was. A look of surprise. It didn't matter how many meetings she led or how many contracts bore her signature. There were still moments when the men across the table looked at her and thought, how did she get here? Camille let the moment pass, just as she always did. But it lingered, threading itself through the conversation like an undercurrent. As the meeting adjourned, Camille gathered her notes, her movements measured and unhurried. Thomas lingered near the door, waiting for her. You know, he said, falling into step beside her. I was thinking about your point on expanding partnerships. It's ambitious. Ambition is part of the job, Camille replied without missing a beat. Thomas chuckled, but there was something behind his laughter. A subtle tension, like he was working his way up to something. They stopped by the elevator. the soft glow of the call button casting shadows on his face. "Look," Thomas began, his voice dipping into a tone Camille recognized too well, the tone men used when they thought they were doing you a favor. "You've been doing great things here. No one doubts that." Camille's eyes narrowed slightly, but she said nothing, waiting for him to continue. "I know these spaces can be tricky. And I just wanted to say, if you ever need someone to smooth things over, I'm happy to step in. Sometimes it helps to have someone like me in your corner." There it was. Camille felt the heat rise behind her ribs. But her expression remained cool. Unreadable. She knew exactly what Thomas meant. Someone like him. A man who could say the same things she said, but have them heard differently. A man who could occupy the same space and not be questioned. Camille let the silence stretch between them, her eyes meeting his with a calm that made him shift slightly. "Thank you, Thomas," she said finally, her tone polite but distant. "But I don't need anyone to smooth things over for me. I've been in rooms like this long before you were." Thomas hesitated, then offered a small, sheepish nod. "Of course, I just thought. I know what you thought." Camille smiled thinly. "But I'm not interested in playing by rules that weren't made for me." The elevator doors opened with a soft chime, and Camille stepped inside, leaving Thomas standing alone in the hallway. As the doors closed, Camille allowed herself a moment of quiet. The battle had been small, hardly noticeable to anyone else. But Camille knew better. The hardest battles were rarely loud. They were fought in the quiet exchanges, in the spaces where doubt tried to take root. And Camille had long since learned that survival in those spaces required more than ambition. It required resolve. By the time Camille returned to her apartment, the city outside her window was dark, the streets below illuminated by flickering headlights and the neon glow of storefronts. She stood by the window, one hand resting lightly against the glass. The skyline stretched out before her, vast and shimmering. But Camille wasn't thinking about the city. She was thinking about thresholds. About the invisible lines people like her crossed every day, the ones no one else seemed to notice. She thought about Karen on the plane, about the man at baggage claim, about Thomas at the elevator. Each of them had drawn their own line. And each time, Camille had stepped over it, as she always did. But tonight, as the city whispered quietly beneath her, Camille wondered how many more lines she would have to cross before the world stopped being surprised to find her on the other side. The morning light crept through the curtains of Camille Jackson's apartment, spilling in thin slivers across the dark wood floors. Camille sat at her kitchen table, coffee cooling in her cup, eyes scanning the newspaper laid out in front of her. The headlines, markets, politics, scandals blurred together into meaningless shapes. It wasn't the news that held her attention. Her mind kept circling back to the previous night, to Thomas, standing outside the elevator, his carefully measured words wrapped in the quiet condescension of someone who thought he was being helpful. "Someone like me." Camille had heard those words before. Not from Thomas, not exactly, but from teachers, colleagues, strangers at cocktail parties who mistook familiarity for understanding. It was the language of those who believed the world would run smoother if people like her were willing to make themselves smaller. But Camille had never been small. She glanced at the clock. 9:30. The day was already in motion. Her phone buzzed, a reminder from her assistant about an upcoming meeting with a new potential partner. A mid-level firm looking to make waves in the tech sector. Camille had agreed to meet with their CEO for lunch at an upscale restaurant downtown. She wasn't in the mood for polite conversation, but she went anyway. The restaurant sat nestled in the heart of the city, all glass and steel. Its minimalist design curated to appeal to the kind of people who measured success in expensive watches and understated suits. Camille arrived 10 minutes early, as she always did, and was led to a corner table by a hostess who flashed her a bright, professional smile that felt just a shade too forced. "We're expecting one more," Camille said, settling into her seat. The hostess nodded, but Camille caught at the slight flicker of hesitation in the woman's eyes. It was small, the kind of thing most people wouldn't notice. But Camille noticed. She always noticed. By the time the CEO arrived, Robert Kinney, a man in his late 30s with the kind of easy confidence that came from knowing the world opened doors for him, Camille had already ordered sparkling water and scanned the menu twice. "Ms. Jackson," Kinney said, extending his hand with a grin that leaned too far toward charm. "I've heard a lot about you." Camille shook his hand firmly. I imagine so. Kinney settled across from her. And the conversation began as these conversations always did, pleasant. Predictable. He talked about his company's growth. The innovations they were spearheading. The ways they could change the game with the right partnerships. Camille listened, but her attention drifted. There was a performance to these meetings. A script that everyone followed. And beneath that script was something quieter. Something Kinney likely wasn't aware of. She could feel it, the same undercurrent that ran through boardrooms and airports. Through first-class cabins and elevator rides. Kinney didn't see Camille as his equal. Not really. He saw her as an opportunity. An anomaly. But anomalies, by their nature, were fragile. The shift came halfway through the meal. Kinney, leaning back in his chair, sipped his wine and asked, So, Camille, I have to ask, how did you break into this industry? I mean, finance isn't exactly known for being, well, welcoming. Camille set her fork down gently. There it was. Kinney said it with the casual ease of someone who believed he was giving a compliment. But Camille knew better. Break into. The words hung in the air. And Camille could feel the weight of them pressing down, folding themselves neatly into the long history of assumptions people made about her. She could have let it slide. She could have smiled, offered some polite answer about hard work and perseverance. But she was tired. Tired in a way that sat deeper than exhaustion. I didn't break into anything, Camille said softly, but there was steel beneath her words. I belong here, just like you. Kinney blinked, caught off guard by the sharpness in her tone. Oh, I didn't mean. I know what you meant. Camille cut in smoothly, her gaze steady. You meant that I don't look like the others you've sat across from. And you're right, I don't. The restaurant seemed quieter suddenly, as if the world had leaned in to listen. Kinney shifted, the easy confidence he carried now slightly frayed at the edges. Camille let the silence linger. Because silence, she had learned, was its own kind of power. By the time the check arrived, Kinney's tone had softened. He spoke carefully, like a man trying to navigate unfamiliar terrain. Camille signed the receipt without a word. As they stood to leave, Kinney extended his hand again. But this time there was hesitation in his movements. It was enlightening, meeting with you, he said, his voice quieter than before. Camille shook his hand. I'm sure it was. As Camille stepped outside, the afternoon sun washed over the streets, casting long shadows beneath the towering skyscrapers. She paused, letting the weight of the conversation slip from her shoulders. It wasn't Kinney's fault, not entirely, but Camille understood something that Kinney, Thomas, and even Karen on the plane did not. Racism was not always loud. It wasn't always wrapped in slurs or shouts. Sometimes, it was quiet. Sometimes, it was in the lingering glance, the raised eyebrow, the way someone hesitated just before saying your name. It lived in the architecture of silence. And Camille had spent her entire life learning how to survive inside that silence. But survival, she knew, was not the same as freedom. She walked toward her waiting car, the city sprawling out before her like a map she had long since memorized. And as she slid into the backseat, Camille Jackson wondered if the day would come when she could stop translating the language of doubt. Or if she would always be speaking in the quiet spaces between other people's words. The boardroom was colder than usual. Not physically, no. The temperature was fine, but there was something in the air that sat heavy. Like an uninvited guest whose presence everyone refused to acknowledge. Camille Jackson entered quietly, moving with the kind of ease that made others uncomfortable. She took her seat at the far end of the long table, setting down her leather folder with deliberate care. The room was full, but as always, it felt just a little too empty around her. They were all there. Thomas, as usual, flipping through notes, his brow furrowed as if he were the one carrying the weight of the company. The others board members, all men save for one, leaned into conversations that didn't require her participation. Camille had come to expect this. She had learned that power didn't always speak loudly. Sometimes it whispered, slipping between words, lingering in the spaces where people thought she wasn't listening. She was always listening. All right, let's begin, Thomas said finally, his voice low but firm. The meeting unfolded as these meetings always did. Projections, risk assessments, expansion plans. Camille contributed sparingly. She waited, watching the way the men spoke to one another, how they deferred, how they exchanged small glances like invisible currency. She had been here before. Not just in this room, but in rooms like it. Rooms where her presence had been earned, but never fully accepted. It was always subtle. The questions that were directed to Thomas, even when the answer belonged to her. The polite but dismissive nods when she spoke acknowledgement without engagement. There was an art to exclusion. Camille had found, and these men were artists. Halfway through the meeting, Thomas glanced down the table. "Camille," he said, gesturing with his pen, "you've been quiet today. I'm curious, what are your thoughts on the proposed merger?" Camille met his gaze, steady and unreadable. "I think it's premature," she said plainly, tapping a finger lightly on her folder. "The company we're considering hasn't proven their model will hold beyond the next quarter. Their projections are ambitious, but ambition isn't revenue. We should wait." Thomas nodded, leaning back in his chair. It was the kind of answer that should have closed the matter. But it didn't. One of the older board members, Richard Hayes, cleared his throat. Hayes was the type of man who filled a room simply by existing in it. His presence alone seemed to validate the decisions being made, even if those decisions were wrong. "With all due respect, Camille," Hayes began, his voice carefully measured, "I'm not sure that hesitation is the right strategy here. If we wait too long, someone else will close the deal." Camille folded her hands together, the weight of his words settling in her chest. It wasn't the argument itself. It was the way he said it. Hesitation. It was a word that followed her. A word used to dismiss careful calculation. When men like Hayes were cautious, they were strategic. But when Camille was cautious, she was hesitant. She smiled faintly. "I prefer precision over speed," Camille replied, her voice as calm as still water. "There's no point in closing the door if we don't know what's on the other side." Hayes opened his mouth to respond, but Camille held his gaze for just a second too long, and he let it go. The meeting continued, but something had shifted. Camille could feel it, the slight change in how the room regarded her. It was always like this. To speak too softly was to be ignored. To speak too firmly was to be labeled difficult. There was no perfect volume for a woman like Camille. When the meeting ended, the board members lingered, exchanging pleasantries and inside jokes she wasn't invited to share. Camille gathered her things in silence. She had almost made it to the door when Thomas called after her. "Camille, a word?" She stopped, turning back with the same calm expression she had worn all day. Thomas waited until the others had filed out, then approached her with a practiced air of familiarity. "You handled Hayes well," Thomas said lightly, slipping his hands into his pockets. "He's not used to being challenged." Camille raised an eyebrow. "Is that what I did?" Thomas smiled, but there was something else there, something cautious. "Look, Camille, you know how this works," he began, lowering his voice slightly. "These guys, they've been here a long time. Sometimes you have to let them feel like they're steering the ship, even when they're not." Camille's expression didn't change. "And sometimes," she replied evenly, "they need to remember who owns the ship." Thomas blinked, surprised by the sharpness in her tone. "I'm not trying to diminish your role," he said quickly. I know exactly what you're trying to do, Thomas." The softness in her voice didn't dull the edge of her words. For a moment, Thomas seemed at a loss, the usual ease in his posture faltering. Camille let him stand there, uncomfortable and unsure, because she knew the truth he hadn't yet admitted to himself. Thomas wasn't trying to protect her. He was trying to make her smaller, just enough to fit into the spaces the men like Hayes had carved out long before she arrived. But Camille Jackson had never been small. And she wasn't about to start now. As she left the office that evening, the weight of the day settled across her shoulders like an old coat. The city lights blinked in the distance. Distant and indifferent, Camille had spent years learning how to carry herself through spaces that weren't built for her. But tonight, as she walked beneath the glow of the streetlights, she wondered how long she could keep carrying that weight alone. The city felt different at night. The streets, slick from the evening rain, reflected the fractured glow of streetlights and headlights, turning the pavement into a shimmering mosaic of light and shadow. Camille Jackson walked slowly, her heels striking a steady rhythm against the concrete, the echoes following her like ghosts she couldn't shake. The weight of the day pressed down, but she carried it the way she carried everything else, in silence. She had learned long ago that silence was not submission. It was strategy. But even strategies had their limits. Camille's phone buzzed in her pocket. Thomas. Again. She let it ring. There was nothing he could say that she hadn't already heard a dozen times before. Wrapped in different words but the same intention. Let them feel like they're steering the ship. Thomas hadn't meant harm, but that was the problem. Camille crossed the street, pausing beneath the awning of a dimly lit cafe. The rain had begun to fall again, soft at first, tapping gently against the canvas overhead. She thought of Richard Hayes, his carefully measured words at the board meeting. She thought of Kinney at lunch, leaning across the table with that easy, careless confidence that seemed to hover just out of her reach. And she thought of Karen, the flight attendant who had taken one look at her and decided without malice, without thought, that Camille didn't belong. It was all part of the same architecture. The world Thomas wanted her to navigate carefully. But Camille wasn't interested in careful navigation. She had spent too much of her life asking for permission to occupy spaces she had every right to stand in. And tonight, she was tired. The cafe door chimed softly as she stepped inside. It was nearly empty, save for an older man sitting by the window, his head bowed over a cup of black coffee. A jazz record played faintly from the corner of the room. Coltrane. If she wasn't mistaken, Camille ordered tea and settled at a table near the back, peeling off her coat and draping it over the chair beside her. The cafe was warm, but not inviting. There were places like this all over the city. Places that promised comfort but didn't extend it freely. She recognized the man by the window. Mr. Lewis. He had once been a regular at the community center Camille's mother took her to as a child. He ran the reading program, introducing her to Baldwin and Morrison when the school library shelves offered nothing but Mark Twain and Dickens. His hair was gray now, the sharpness in his features softened by time, but there was no mistaking him. Mr. Lewis, Camille said softly, standing near his table. The old man looked up slowly, his eyes narrowing before recognition flickered across his face. Camille Jackson, he said, his voice low and warm. Look at you. Camille smiled, easing into the seat across from him without waiting for an invitation. It's been a long time, she said. He nodded, taking a slow sip from his cup. Too long. I hear about you now and then. Big CEO, isn't that right? That's what they say. Camille replied lightly. Mr. Lewis chuckled, shaking his head. They said the same thing about me once. He murmured, though the edges of his smile didn't quite reach his eyes. Camille tilted her head. I remember. You were the first black principal in the district. My mother still talks about it. Mr. Lewis set his cup down carefully, his fingers lingering against the ceramic. Yes, he said quietly. I was. Camille caught the shift in his tone, the way his voice dipped into something heavier, something unsaid. They didn't make it easy for you, she added, more statement than question. Mr. Lewis looked out the window, watching the rain slide down the glass in thin, winding trails. They never do, he replied. They let you in, Camille, but they don't let you forget how you got there. The words settled between them, familiar and unwelcome. Camille thought of Thomas again. Sometimes you have to let them feel like they're steering the ship. She wrapped her hands around the warm cup in front of her, the heat bleeding into her palms. How long? She asked softly. Does that last? Mr. Lewis met her gaze. And for a long moment, he said nothing. Then, quietly, until you stop asking the question. Camille's grip tightened around the cup. She knew what he meant. You stopped asking when you accepted the weight as part of the deal. When you learned to carry it without expecting it to lessen. But Camille wasn't sure she could. Or if she wanted to. I don't know if that's good advice, Camille said finally. Mr. Lewis smiled faintly, but there was a sadness to it. It's not advice, he replied. It's just the truth. By the time Camille left the cafe, the rain had slowed to a drizzle. The city wrapped in a damp, quiet stillness. She walked back toward her apartment, the lights of the high-rise towers flickering like distant signals against the dark sky. Camille thought of her mother's words, the ones she used to recite when Camille was young. You don't ask permission to take up space, baby. You walk in like the room was built for you. Her mother had meant well. But Camille knew something now that she hadn't understood then. The room wasn't built for her. And no matter how confidently she walked into it, there would always be someone, Thomas Hayes, Karen, waiting to remind her of that fact. But as she stood at the entrance of her building, looking up at the glowing windows above, Camille felt something shift. Maybe the point wasn't to pretend the room was hers. Maybe the point was to stop caring who thought it wasn't. Camille Jackson had long known the difference between stepping into a room and being in it. There was a fine line between the two, almost imperceptible, but once you crossed it, the air changed. People listened differently. They measured your words with more weight or none at all. And some days, that line felt like a chasm. She could feel it now, as she stood before the glass doors of the conference hall, her reflection staring back at her, poised but tired. Inside, the annual investor summit was already in motion, the hum of conversation bleeding faintly through the sleek barriers between her and the crowd. Camille adjusted the cuff of her blazer. This wasn't new. She had stood at the edge of rooms like this for most of her career, knowing that the moment she crossed the threshold, the weight of expectation would press down on her like a hand at the back of her neck. She wasn't afraid of it, but she was tired of carrying it alone. The hall was packed, hundreds of investors, analysts, and executives clustered in small knots of whispered conversation, the kind of people who wore wealth lightly, like a coat they could shrug off whenever the room grew too warm. Camille stepped inside, and though no one turned to stare, she felt their awareness settle over her like a second skin. Thomas was already there, standing by the buffet table, his laughter carrying just above the murmur of voices. When he saw her, he smiled and crossed the room, greeting her with the ease of someone who believed they belonged everywhere. "Camille," he said, gripping her hand a little too firmly. "Glad you made it. These things are never the same without you." Camille returned his smile, though hers didn't linger as long. "I'm sure they'd survive," she replied, scanning the room over his shoulder. Thomas chuckled, lowering his voice. "You're a draw, whether you admit it or not. They like the story, Camille. Makes them feel progressive." Camille met his gaze evenly. "They can like the story," she said, "as long as they respect the author." Thomas's smile faltered, just for a second, before he stepped aside to let her pass. She could feel him watching as she moved through the crowd. The first real crack appeared during the panel discussion. Camille sat alongside 3 other CEOs, each of them middle-aged white men whose introductions were met with polite applause and nods of recognition. When it was Camille's turn, the applause felt different, warmer, perhaps a touch more enthusiastic. She could see it in their faces, the admiration, but also the curiosity. How did she get here? Camille adjusted her microphone, letting the room settle into quiet. The moderator, a man whose name she hadn't bothered to remember, began the session with the usual round of questions: company growth, market trends, leadership strategies. But Camille knew, sooner or later, the conversation would turn. It always did, and sure enough, as the session wound down, the moderator smiled and leaned slightly toward her. "Camille," he said, his voice carrying the kind of performative interest that felt premeditated, "you've built one of the most successful firms in the industry. As a woman and as a woman of color, how has that shaped your leadership style?" The room went still. Camille's grip on the microphone tightened fractionally. She could feel their eyes waiting for her to say something palatable. "Tell them it's about resilience. Tell them you worked harder, pushed farther. Tell them what they want to hear." Camille smiled slowly, deliberately. "Funny," she said, her voice soft but sharp enough to cut the quiet. "I've been in rooms like this for years, and no one's ever asked Thomas how being a white man shaped his leadership style." Laughter rippled through the crowd, low but unmistakable. The moderator's smile stiffened. Camille let the moment hang there, her eyes sweeping across the faces in the audience. She wasn't angry, but she was tired of pretending that the question was innocent. Because it wasn't. It was the same question she had been answering her entire life, wrapped in different words, the same subtle attempt to remind her that she was an anomaly. When the session ended, several people approached her, some to shake her hand, others to offer vague praise about how refreshing her perspective was. Thomas was one of the last to speak. "You didn't have to do that," he said quietly, his tone light but edged with something else. "Yes, I did," Camille replied without looking at him. Thomas sighed, slipping his hands into his pockets. "Look, Camille, I get it, but calling it out in front of everyone, it makes them uncomfortable." Camille turned to him, meeting his gaze without flinching. "Good," she said. Thomas blinked, clearly not expecting that answer. "Maybe discomfort is exactly what they need," Camille added. She let that sink in before walking away. By the time Camille left the summit, the sun was sinking low over the city skyline, casting long shadows across the glass towers. The weight was still there, resting just beneath her ribs. But tonight, it felt lighter. Not because the world had changed, but because Camille had stopped asking it to. She stepped into the back of the waiting car, watching the streets blur past the window as the city moved on without her. The world, Camille realized, would always draw lines in front of her. But she had learned something tonight. She didn't need their permission to cross them.